right, well, welcome. We last week we began our new chapter in looking at the changes. I'm using the term the theological changes. That's maybe not the best phrase. These changes from what had long been the traditionally held view on a lot of things, and a lot of this started happening in the 50s. Kind of, like anything, it kind of percolates small and then gets larger and affects a whole lot more things. And while we looked at have been looking at quite a while now what happened in the 60s and what brought that about and so on. Now we're looking at kind of what we might call the theological changes. And so as we looked at last week, we saw that another one of the struggles the church is going to have is what has been termed liberalism. And of course, we said liberalism, when you really get down to it, is anybody that's a certain direction from where I am, that makes them liberal. And anybody that's another direction the other way is more this. And so you got this big spectrum. And so you may be, way over here, and so they're this and they're that. And yet if you're here, all of them are that, and so on and so forth. And so very interesting. But basically what was going on, and had been going on for over 100 years, and probably even before that, was the effects of modernism. And we said what modernism did, and that came about because of science and just a whole lot of things that we've already covered in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so as it percolated and worked its way through, it kind of came to that full fruition. And of course, what did modernism do? Modernism challenged all kinds of things and the ideas in society, in philosophy, in religion, in all kinds of things. They questioned that. Well, this is the way we've always done it. Why? What's other things that we had, and so on and so forth. Well, this as we saw, created lots of change, which we've documented significantly. And so, in our fellowship, we were affected by those things too, often later than many of the others, it seems, but nonetheless. And so when we ended up last time, we were just beginning to talk about two major figures that we've heard of, and that's Carl Ketcherside and Leroy Garrett. And of course, Carl was Griff's grandfather, and Jerry, who was here for a time, Jerry was his son. And so he was a very significant figure, and so we started talking about that. And so what we're going to see is there's kind of three main groups that we started talking about. There is what you would call the mainstream, which is always the largest content. And the mainstream accepted, some of these changes, but wanted to hold on to a whole lot of the way things were looked at. Then you had what we've termed as progressive. And remember, these terms are very subjective depending on where you're at. And as I mentioned last week, when Gary and I were talking, and I read the source of where he came up with this, but this is quite a while back, but we were talking that in churches of Christ, our liberalism or progressivism is really way on the spectrum toward the conservative compared to many other of the Christian bodies out there, just for context, generally. And so what was progressive? The idea behind progressive term is that there is progress, that there is improvement, that there is change. We've heard this term in the political realm, dealing with the late 19th and early 20th century with the social gospel. Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive. So on and so forth. There were many others. And so we've even heard that term in more recent years in the political realm. And then for some, that wasn't progressive enough. and so on and so forth. So again, very subjective. And so this tradition, in a sense, as we look at our history, you can look back to two major figures. Now remember, whenever you look at things, there's always more, but to look at things historically, you usually focus on some key and significant people. And so it's not to leave others out, but nonetheless. Carl Ketcherside and Leroy Garrett, two men who on the eve of the 60s called Churches of Christ to abandon both legalism and exclusivism, to cultivate a greater appreciation for the grace of God and to manifest a greater tolerance for Christians of other traditions. Well, as you can imagine, this was not widely received, this kind of thinking at that time. Bill, were you going to say something? Yes.
Inclusivism?
Exclusivism. Did I say it wrong? Okay. I think I spelled it right, so I might have worded it.
What's the difference between those two?
Well, exclusive means us, not you. Exclusive means us, not you. Inclusive means bringing others. Yes. Yes, that idea. Yeah. And so, which was, of course, and we've been documenting this from back into the 19th century even in certain segments. But anyhow, Garrett, and again, in your bibliography that I handed you, Carl's autobiography was called Pilgrimage of Joy, and that's one of the books that was listed. And Leroy Garrett's is called A Lover's Quarrel, and they're both very, very fascinating and excellent books to read from telling their story. And so we're only getting, we're only telling a little bit of it because there's so much more, but we just can't cover all that. But anyhow, Garrett, as we said, grew up in the mainline churches, but as an adult, he embraced what we've called the anti-institutional position. And as you remember, that was the understanding that the New Testament doesn't authorize congregations to support these other institutions beyond the local congregation, whether that be colleges, whether that be children's homes, whether that be missions overseas, and thus the missionary society that we've talked about in the past. That's kind of what's involved with that. And the belief is we don't have the authority. God didn't tell us that we can do that, and the only examples we have is, and so that's part of that hermeneutic or way of looking at things that we've talked about, and we'll talk about more. Ketcherside, on the other hand, came from the Daniel Summer or Summerite tradition, which we covered extensively also. And they were not known for being very gracious or very ecumenical. They were very much, unless you toe the line on however long the list is, that's not correct. Even in the middle years of the 20th century, this small wing, and it was interesting, I was reading something this morning that seemed that, if assuming this was accurate, that this wing would have been about 15-20% of churches of Christ. And again, there's always a spectrum. And they maintained their radically democratic tradition of opposition to Bible colleges, located preachers, missionary societies, and any other innovation that might challenge the independence of the local congregation. And so if you have anything that somebody can dictate down to us, something other than what we want to, or that we believe, or so on and so forth, we're against that. And so that lens, or that understanding of that, and again, we're all familiar with, in our Churches of Christ, that very strong foundational thing that all congregations are local. And so, we don't have a hierarchy. We don't have a bishop somewhere, like in Jefferson City or something, trying to tell all the other congregations what we're to do. We determine that. And so that's a very strong thing. We looked at that extensively, the idea of America, so on and so forth, and why that developed. but nonetheless, well, some held on to that very strongly, and any deviation from that would make it not proper. It also maintained a highly exclusivistic sensibility. Members tended to identify their own wing of the Churches of Christ with the fullness of the kingdom of God. And by the early 50s, the thinking of Ketcherside and Garrett began to change. And so everybody had their own little groups. And you're not enough this, you're not enough that, you're too much this, you're too much that. And so, where that fell on the spectrum depended on who you were. In so many cases, higher education led Garrett to an appreciation of Christians and other traditions and prompted him to question many of the fundamental presuppositions we had in our fellowship. From 1938 to 1942, Garrett attended colleges related to our fellowship. Freed-Hardeman in Henderson, Tennessee, Abilene Christian College, now university. In 1943, he earned a master's degree from Southern Methodist University. And in 1948, a Bachelor of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. And hungry for further learning, he enrolled at Harvard in 1949 and graduated with a doctorate in philosophy of religion in 1957. Now, we may look at this and say, well, why didn't he get his master's and his doctorate from one of our institutions? Well, because our institutions at this time couldn't offer those. And so just in a nutshell, the way it works is to order, or in order to offer and have accredited graduate programs, you have to have professors, teachers, however you want to term that have doctorate degrees. And so as a result, in order to where those were eventually offered in our schools, our people had to go to these other schools to get those degrees. Yes, Bill? Do what? Well, in his case, yeah, he loved learning. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, part of the reason his doctorate took a while was he's also out preaching, and it wasn't that he was full time there all the time, and so that's a little bit of it. So anyhow, so this is significant, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but that's why they went to other places for these higher degrees. And Leroy was one of them. And so in these experiences, and he documents this extensively in his book, Lover's Quarrel, he became exposed to other things. If you hang out with just your own people that think just the way you do, other perspectives make no sense. And yet, if you talk to others, maybe those other perspectives are like, oh, wait, that's not so crazy as I was always told, and so on and so forth. And so that's what you have happening here, this exposure and a challenge to the things that were said, and then they experience, they go, well, that's not quite like I was told, and stuff. And so that's what we have happening here. Now, in 1952, 3 years after enrolling at Harvard, Garrett launched a publication he called Bible Talk. And in it, he regularly tackled, if you will, Churches of Christ as what he felt as having changed and twisted, perverted, if you will, that 19th century ecumenical vision that Thomas and Alexander Campbell and others had really promoted. And just to step back a second, what was that? Well, we said that in our heritage, which was greatly influenced by the Enlightenment, and that, of course, started over in Europe in the 18th and even 17th century, and part of that was that thinking and that more rational approach to things and so on. And one of the reasons was they saw the Catholics and the Protestants, and even Protestants among Protestants, what were they doing? well, if you thought differently, I got to go kill you, or I got to put you in jail, or I got to burn you at the stake. And so we documented that. And so there were those that said, hey, wait a minute. This shouldn't be what's going on. And so remember, Campbell was affected by that history and by those personal experiences that he had. And so this idea of how can we be unified, and so it was the idea of simplifying it down to what are those basic essentials. Nowadays we might call them core kind of understandings, rather than every little nitpick and nuance and so on. So that's what's going here. In fact, Garrett claimed churches of Christ in the 20th century stood for the very kind of sectarianism and exclusivism that Campbell had fought against initially then. Christiana.
Would say that, was it Alexander or Thomas Campbell who said, we are Christians only, but not the only Christians?
That would have been, I think, Thomas came up with that first.
Yeah.
And that became a very significant plea, of which the Christian churches tended to adopt that more freely, necessarily than our wing did later on. And so Christiana said was the phrase, we're Christians only, but not the only Christians. And so acknowledging others. For that reason, Garrett renounced his allegiance to our group, meaning I'm not exclusively a Church of Christ guy. And he identified himself instead with the universal kingdom of God. I now make no choice among the denominations, including the Church of Christ, he insisted. I consider myself a Christian and a brother of all saints, wherever there may be, in churches of Christ, Christian churches, and other churches as well. Garrett discontinued Bible Talk in 1958, but in 1959 he launched his next publication, which was called Restoration Review. And I think that lasted to maybe the early 90s. It was continuous till then, in which he continued to challenge churches of Christ in a greater sense of grace and larger ecumenical spirit. And so this idea, introduced in our fellowship and history, really raised a huge commotion, if you want to put it that way, because that went against so much that so many held of that very exclusive things. And so he was labeled, he was blackballed, he was denounced, he was all those things, because, whoa, that is so out there. Instead of maybe saying, why did he come to that conclusion, and asking questions like that, just kind of assumed that he was just off. And so many dismissed him. Now Carl Ketcherside, on the other hand, came to those same conclusions, but through a very different route. He was a child of a poor Midwestern miner. He grew up in southeast Missouri, Bonne Terre, Flat River. If anybody's been down to the Boy Scout camp, the SBRF, that's down in that area, that general area. And so that's where he grew up. And so the Summerite tradition was very strong down there. Did I get all the towns in, Betty? Did I mention all the towns? All the proper towns? 'Cause that's where Betty's from. So Betty was down there. Betty knew this. Betty knew them. So on. So even a smaller little village almost.
What was the name?
What was the town?
Cantwell, Cantwell.
Cantwell.
Ah.
Yeah. So anyhow, you said never heard of it. Yeah, probably most of the people in the world have never heard of it.
Oh.
Deloge, the big city of Deloge. And so anyhow, now he never attended college. Never got to attend college. but he was a real smart guy. And so, just so we all know, just because you have a college degree doesn't make you smart. And just because you don't have one doesn't mean you aren't. My mom never went to college, but she was smart as a whip. And so, and Betty's smart as a whip, and she said she never went to college. So, again, obviously I was a little different then, the amount of people that went and so on and so forth. But anyhow, but what he did do is he had learned to read, and he read voraciously as a child and as a young man. And he recalled in his autobiography that he grew up in Marshalltown, Iowa, that they built a Carnegie Library there. And of course, Ryan would know what a Carnegie Library was, right? I hope. Okay, wow. Ryan works in our St. Charles County Library system, is why I threw him out there like that. So sorry about that. Well, Andrew Carnegie, the great, I think he was steel magnate in Pittsburgh. And this was in the Gilded Age, the late 19th century, and there was no income taxes, and they had billions and billions and billions, or at least nowadays it would be that. And so these people like him and others did, philanthropic, I said that wrong, sorry, works. And what Carnegie did was he built libraries and stocked them in all these smaller towns and places like that around the country as a way of, using his wealth. And so that's what that is, because there was not the proliferation of libraries that we might consider now. And by that I don't mean too many, but just there wasn't near as many. And so that's what that's referring to. And so when he got a chance to read those books, he got into them, and he claimed he read as many as 1 or 2 a day. And so just gobbled it up. And so that opened a whole lot of things to him and knowledge. If you've ever read any of his publications like Mission Messenger and so on, excellent writer. Just very, very readable and really good. Now, Ketcherside left his Lutheran roots, which I believe was on his mother's side. I think that's correct. To join the Summerite wing in the Church of Christ in 1920. Now, he was 12, and he became known as a boy preacher. And so from 12, he's going around, and of course in those days you had your meetings. And remember, they were part of the no-located preacher. So the idea of hiring somebody and being here in one spot, you don't do that because that's not in the Scripture as their understanding. But they had preachers, and they traveled around and gave love offerings, or however you want to say that, circuit preachers, things such as that. And so he became well known for that, and as was the style and the method of the times, he became a great debater. And we said, and we look back at that clear in the 19th century and so on, that idea of debating things. And so there's a topic, you debate it. And so that's how things were covered. So he became a very well-known debater promoting the Summerite wing of understandings of things. And he went against G.C. Brewer, who was more mainstream, and all kinds of others. And he talks about this in his Pilgrimage of Joy. And so he became very well known, and had a big following. And he also had published, starting in 1939, his Mission Messenger. Remember, everybody had their own little publication, because that's how you disseminated thoughts and ideas and so on and so forth, because we didn't have a hierarchy. We didn't have the central administration, if you will, or a publication and things such as that. And so that's how those things were done. And however, in 1951, something very dramatic happened. And he was overseas, and I think he was in Ireland. I think that's correct. And he preached in a little Presbyterian meeting house in Ohori, if I'm saying that right, which is near Rich Hill in Northern Ireland. And that is where Thomas Campbell once was a minister. And as you read in his story, and he goes into quite a bit of detail about it, he had an experience. Something came over him. And so after all these many years of going about this, it's like, it was almost like the Damascus light. Sort of. He wouldn't claim he was knocked down or something, but of what happened. And it says the recognition, to sum it up, of what we had done to the noble restoration movement that this humble man, meaning Thomas Campbell, helped to launch, caused me to completely re-examine my own life and the whole movement as it now exists. And so he had a real epiphany. He had that moment that just kind of blew him away. Now, what all that meant, what all that, so on, obviously in a lot of things it happens over time. And so, yes, Bill?
For this change of heart, whatever you want to call it, some of us would relate that to the Holy Spirit.
And I think he would too. He would too. That the Spirit, and of course, in our tradition, the Spirit wasn't looked at in that way. Especially. And so the work of the Spirit was assigned to just being in the Scripture, and that's the only way the Spirit could even talk to you, and so on and so forth. And again, not promoting a Pentecostal understanding of things, but nonetheless. Pardon? Oh, correct. Yeah, that's not gone.
True, that. Yeah.
But that's not as broadly held in our fellowship as it once was. And so, important to point out. So from 1951 to 1957, so you got a 6-year period, and this guy's a reader. Carl's a reader. He reread virtually everything of importance written in conjunction with the Restoration Movement. And so as you read his autobiography, he got a hold and he said, I read every single millennial harbinger and Christian Baptist that he could get a hold of. And I don't know if he went, and this is just a little side note, but so much of this recorded history, meaning these publications and so on, were collected and held by the Disciples Wing. And I think that's called the Disciples Historical Society. I think I got the name a little wrong. And for a long time, it was in Nashville. And several years ago, they moved it up to Bethany, West Virginia. They're right near Pittsburgh on the grounds of what was Alexander Campbell's home. And when Donnie and I were up there a number of years ago, and I go, we've got to go see Campbell's home, we went, that had happened. Now, it was in boxes stuck on shelves at the time. They hadn't reorganized it or whatever. But that's where the collection. Now, not that there aren't others, but that's the biggest collection of these things. Now, I don't know that I don't remember if he went to Nashville to get these or whatever, but nonetheless, so he read all this source material, if you will, of our restoration movement. And he became convinced that what was going on now, when he was not what they had envisioned. And so he said that I started to help us to regain some sanity in the midst of our divided state. And so he became deeply convicted of the division and et cetera, that was so prominent in things. Well, remember, that goes against the grain. Now, in 1939, Ketcherside had begun a journal called the Mission Messenger that had significant circulation among the Summerite Churches of Christ. In 1957, he then took his paper and he took it in more ecumenical directions. In other words, instead of the exclusive tone, he started questioning so much of that and urged churches of Christ at large to abandon the myth that there is no difference between the church in which Jesus died and our congregation today. And of course, remember, that was a strong narrative that we were told. We have restored the New Testament church, and our goal is to do things just like they have in whatever that happens to be, and that we've done that. And so the goal is we must maintain that, and any challenge to that is a challenge against that goal. So that's kind of a larger view of that. And so in time, the Mission Messenger gained a worldwide circulation of some 8,000 readers, which was very significant for something like this. Now, and I've shared this a little before, I encountered Mission Messengers, some copies that were from the early 60s. And I think, as I've said before, it turned out that my English teacher, when I was a sophomore in high school, and I didn't know any of this at the time, but recognized his name on these things later, much after I was out of high school. And I read these Mission Messengers, and at the time in my life, when we had come out of the Boston movement and just a whole lot of reevaluating of a whole lot of things, when I was reading these I was like 2 or 3 years old when he happened to write the ones I was reading. They seemed so fresh to me and just really touched me, and here it was 30 years later. And so just my own personal statement. Now, when Ketcherside and Garrett first began circulating their views, most leaders in the mainstream churches of Christ found it easy to dismiss them as representatives of the small schismatic traditions fixed on opposition to the modernizing tendencies of the larger denomination. Now, earlier on, we kind of covered that the mainstream congregations got so fed up with all the constant, griping, if you want to term it that or whatever, on all these things, that they just said, you all just need to go. And so we don't want to have much to do with you. And so then we had more of that wing that started and so on. So that's what this is referring to. As their perspectives changed, meaning Garrett's and Ketcherside's, they began to attack the bedrock presuppositions, not only the summarized. And so this caused upheaval. And there were those that embraced it as a breath of fresh air, and there was others that, fought it to no end. So leaders among churches of Christ began to characterize them, meaning Garrett and Ketcherside, as fundamentally unstable men who had ridden the swinging pendulum they'd gone from that total right-wing way to now they're just way over here with these liberals. And so they're just dismissing them. And so the truth was quite the reverse. Even though Ketcherside and Garrett had adopted more tolerant perspectives, both men didn't throw out everything that they ever held or understood or things like that, such as that radically democratic, anti-institutional perspective. They held on to that. What they didn't do, or what had really changed, was they didn't demand that you had to hold that position, otherwise you weren't right. That was one of the main things that changed, was that attitude. And so that was significant. No incident more dramatically illustrates this point than when Garrett visited in 1955 to Freed Hardeman. Remember, he attended there. And it was, of course, in eastern Tennessee, or western Tennessee, in Henderson. He had been up at the Cincinnati Bible College, which was a Christian church institution. Okay. Now, the disciples and the independent Christian churches had not yet split from each other, and so this was the disciples' Christian church wing of things. And so that was one of their Bible colleges. And so he was traveling from there to his home in Dallas. And so he's going to go by the old stomping grounds, if you will. And he was invited there by students to come and talk to him. Now, what's going on now is the big lectureship. And of course, most of us know what those were, but at our universities or schools, they would often hold lectureships where they had a lot of different speakers speaking on, whatever the topics happen to be or the theme. And so Christians would go to those events and listen to the speakers, listen to the debates, listen to all that's going on, and those are called lectureships. Now, those still exist, but most of them, if not all of them, aren't called lectureships anymore. They, like down at summer celebration now at Lipscomb, Jubilee, I'm not sure what it's called down in Harding, and maybe it's called lectureship, I'm not sure, but some of that changed. But that's what this format is. And so, however, they heard, meaning the administration heard he was coming. And he was going just to not raise a big mess or not protest, nothing like that. He was going and was going to talk to those students because they had asked him to. Well, you didn't do those kind of things. You're a rabble-rouser. You're a troublemaker. You're saying things different than what we hold on to. And so for 3 years, as editor of Bible Talk, Garrett had challenged that exclusive identity of Churches of Christ on one hand and their efforts to modernize and institutionalize on the other. In other words, Garrett was also a critic of those changes that we've talked about that were going on in the universities in the 20th century, early 20th century. And so he wasn't necessarily a big fan of that for whatever reason. Now at Freed-Hardeman, in private conversation with small groups of people, he was sharing those ideas and questioning even the very right for the school to exist as it did. Well, you could see why the school would be concerned, if you will, from that point of view. Comparing it to the missionary society and usurping the work of the church, or so the argument went. Learning of these conversations, the school's administration warned Garrett not to stir up any confusion. And what was the confusion? From the way we think you should look at it, and forthwith threatened him with legal action. Okay? Now, it says in Corinthians, you shouldn't go, suing each other or whatever, over church things. But nonetheless, those things have happened, as happened. And so when the students invited him to discuss his perspective with them in their dormitory rooms, so kind of a Bible talk in the room, so to speak, the administrators repeatedly advised Garrett that they would not permit him to visit the dormitory and would have him arrested if he tried to do so. Garrett informed the administration that he fully intended to visit the dormitory on the grounds that he was a Freed-Hardeman alumnus and had done nothing wrong. And true to the word, the administration summoned the police who arrested Garrett, charging him with being a public nuisance, and locked him up in jail for the night. Well, and again, we've all done that. I don't mean lock people up, but in other words, like it's okay for my thoughts, but not for yours. And again, I think we all understand that at times things aren't appropriate to do, and we're not talking about that. But nonetheless, we see this challenge, and what it is a challenge to the status quo. They locked him up for the night. I mean, he wasn't, in the state penitentiary or something. Yeah.
Where you're trying to gather understanding, you're trying to come up with something, and then later on in life you're accused of not being a free thinker. There's someone on every neighborhood or on every street corner.
One person's free thinking is another person, yeah, and again, we all could pick our issues on which we're on one side or the other, and we've all done that, or whatever. So, but nonetheless, we see this challenge that's going on. In fact, in some ways, we see this playing out today. Doesn't matter what side of the argument you're on. In the politics, we see this very thing happening, has been happening for a while, but nonetheless, just to illustrate the idea. While the work of Ketcherside and Garrett reflected the rising educational level among churches of Christ and appealed to a more educated clientele, okay, in other words, the exposure to the schools leads to realizing things and new ideas. Now, some people look at that as terrible. For example, probably many of us look at, we hear the stories of universities and how they're corrupting our students' minds and teaching them to think all kinds of things that probably many of us find very objectionable. And so that's kind of the mindset that's going on here. And so that's not saying that's all nutty or terrible, or we should never ever think that. But nonetheless, we see, we're not trying to say that all ideas are equal, but nonetheless. Now, what's interesting, as educated, Carl by his reading and other things, and Garrett the other way, that neither of these men belong to the growing network of biblical theological scholars who emerged in our mainstream churches of Christ in the 60s. Okay, now, it doesn't mean necessarily disagree with them. Just saying that's a different thrust of what they're doing. And that's where whereas Ketcherside and Garrett might be talking about perspective or attitudinal changes toward things, these scholars were going to be challenging our theological understandings of things, meaning that which is different than we have held. And some assumed that was bad and terrible and awful and part of this decline and corruption in others, whereas others looked at it as, hey, there's some points to be made here. Go ahead.
It's just so important for children to be raised in families.
Sure.
Where a husband and wife are helping to instill in a child a good conscience. I remember my father talking to me about going to Boy Scout camp, and we had this Indian lore issue going on back near Kansas City.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my dad taking me aside and saying, now son, this is a program to help people understand what's good and right. There may be some issues here that you don't agree with. Yeah. Or when I went to college, and his sensitivity to me about, you may hear some things that you haven't been brought up with. Use your head.
Yeah. And that's always a challenge. I've always felt or learned over time that, there shouldn't be any questions that are taboo. And as you study things, I think one of two things generally happen. This is just my thinking. Maybe it's not complete. But one is you will either reject what's being said because it makes no sense and based on your study and evidence and so on, or you may hold on to what you always held, or you might change it. And that isn't bad if you're seeking out what truth is, as you understand that. And so that's what we kind of have happening here. The progressive movement in the Churches of Christ could never have risen apart from the institutions of higher learning that were established early in the century. And there's kind of an irony here, but not unprecedented, that these colleges, which were basically formed to instill our understanding or orthodoxy, if you will, in our fellowship, as other Christian groups have with their schools. But that actually helped to kind of undermine it, because the thinking that was coming out of that was challenging the orthodoxy of why the schools were established in the first place. But that's not unique, and that's probably always happened that way. And so we've got to stop there because we're quarter after. So thank you, and we will continue. I hope we're finding this interesting as we're trying to understand and explore. Yes?
Next week?
I'm not sure. Meaning
That
what?
was in your last picture.
Well, that was just showing the school that was established. That was what is now Lipscomb University, originally in Nashville. And so when this was established in the 1890s is when Lipscomb was, what we now call Lipscomb was established. It was the Nashville Bible School. And so I'm just showing an old-time picture of the old-time Bible school. That was the whole purpose of that. Okay? Good. Thank you.